So with the upcoming Season 4 announcement, they're making a very strange decision. And let me tell you why I'm not exactly excited for this announcement. For me, I like the competitive landscape to be even and smooth. I've done Mists of Scythe, for example, so many times that I feel like I've learned every trick in it and I've mastered it. Every once in a while, some new things do come up and seasonal changes to these routes do impact the way you do the keys. But for the most part, I feel very at home in that dungeon and all of the Shadowlands dungeons. It'd be like this for every expansion's dungeons after a year plus of doing them. You get really good at them and you start feeling like you're able to make progress within the actually intended difficulty of the dungeon compared to where you're at with your character. The problem is when they add new dungeons like Tazavesh, a lot of people are not at the same starting point for those dungeons. Tazavesh especially didn't really get a lot of play outside of Season 3, and you could tell a lot of people were coming into it not even understanding the very basics. So those types of things have always been problems whenever they add new dungeons in Mythic Plus, and that's one of the key things I've been trying to tell people. People are like, oh, I can't believe how few dungeons they add over the course of an expansion anymore, and that's a good thing because you have the same pool of dungeons that you're able to become masters at over the course of a long stretch of time. So going all the way back to Warlords of Draenor is a very suspect decision. These dungeons did include Mythic Plus, but I just want to tell you a little bit about how that worked. It was called Challenge Mode. Very different concept, but still very similar. Certainly much more similar than anything else the game had ever had at that point. It was a time dungeon. Think of it now how you could like triple upgrade a key. Well, that was what gold was in the past. You had to triple upgrade these dungeons, but just say like the highest dungeon difficulty you would ever do would be 15. Like it wasn't very hard out of the gate. If you were just going for completion, there was zero challenge to it, but the hard part was actually doing them very fast. And Blizzard designed these dungeons knowing that. This started to become a real issue when you started to look at what they had for count at the time. It worked completely differently where every mob gave the same one and you just need to kill so many mobs. So in Grimrail Depot, for example, I believe the number is 36 and you just need to kill 36 mobs of any type, no matter how, if they're a mini boss or they're a very small mob. The problems with these dungeons ultimately came in just the way players would try to consume them. Like obviously Blizzard had this idea in their head on how they would want the dungeon to play out, and people just did not care about that. They would take every possible means to increase their time, and that made complete sense when you're talking about a static difficulty that never got any harder. But in the Wild West of 5-mans, a lot of these things slip under the radar of Blizzard, and once they're in and being used heavily, they try not to make changes to them so they don't upset the balance of like where the progression of timer is. So in challenge modes, this has never been more true. They saw people basically destroying dungeons in like 5 minutes or less, and they're like, well, we can make all these changes to like the actual geometry of the dungeon, but doing so would completely ruin those timers. Like they would never be beat. And that was really the only reason people did challenge modes competitively in WoD and MoP, was because there was a scoreboard that people were trying to get to the top of, and I believe there was like titles and recognition for that at the time. That means that they're either going to have to completely redesign this dungeon or it's going to be an absolute mess. I'm not sure which is more possible, to be honest, because the fact that they're even doing this season means that they're behind in their development time of 10.0. So that makes me ask the question, in what state are we going to get these dungeons in? The thing about all these dungeons is, outside of Grimrail Depot, yeah, they could probably just be right in the mix in Shadowlands dungeons and you might not even notice. But Grimrail Depot is a completely different situation. So I actually have some footage here that I want to show you guys about some of the things that were really annoying in this dungeon and things that I think are drawing parallels to the last few expansions that you guys probably didn't like in BFA and Shadowlands, and I know if you didn't like it there, you definitely won't like it in a new dungeon that you're only going to potentially do for a few months and then it'll be gone again. But ultimately, I don't really care. To be honest, I don't like this idea anyway, so no matter what dungeons they bring back, I probably won't be satisfied. You guys are welcome to vote for whatever you want, but I do want to just say the reason I'm making this video is because I had this interaction with somebody that I've known for a while, and it really opened my eyes. Someone posted a picture of Grimrail Depot leading by a significant margin, and they were very happy about that. He said, "This is one of the best dungeons ever. It's my favorite WoD dungeon for sure." And I said, "Wow, I'm really surprised to hear you say that. Did you do it on challenge mode? Because to me, it's the worst dungeon ever made for a timed run." And the individual said, "Oh no, I never did it on challenge mode, but it's my favorite WoD dungeon. And I really like trains, basically." So there's going to be a lot more than trains involved in this dungeon. And I think a lot of people are probably in that boat. I've already talked to Geg as well, and he's very excited to do Upper Blackrock Spire again, but I'm not sure how many people actually know how different that dungeon is than the classic version and how many people actually spent time in there. And so I think a lot of it really depends on how they tune it and balance it. And I'm certainly willing to give Blizzard the benefit of the doubt here. If they can retune the problem points in this dungeon, then maybe, yeah, Grimrail Depot and some of these as well could actually be really fun dungeons. But I don't think a lot of people know just how absurd challenge mode progression was and how the timers worked and how things were overcame in that scenario. So let's take a look. I actually have a full video on every single challenge mode. I made guides on them. Not very good, to be honest. I will link it below if you want to have a laugh. Pretty kind of embarrassing looking back, but I am who I am. So we'll look, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of these issues here, because I think there's a relatively long list of things that people really won't like in this dungeon when it comes to a timed dungeon scenario. So my biggest issue, like number one on this list, was always that they just gave you 36 enemies when they know there's like 42 enemies in the dungeon. It's so annoying. I hate when dungeons have this. This is also the way it was in King's Rest. So if you guys always hated doing finicky skips in King's Rest, this is the king of it. This was the progenitor. This was the first of many. And even though it kind of still happens in some dungeons, like you could kind of say like that in Mist Eternal Sight, I feel like they've done a lot better job of eliminating that. Now, obviously Blizzard could just fix this by making every single mob in the dungeon needed, but the big problem that I have here is that skipping any single mob is an absolute pain. And it's just like King's Rest in that way, where it's a straight line. This dungeon has no space in it whatsoever. And that's going to be another point on this list, but you cannot skip any of these mobs conventionally. You have to do it with an invis pot or a shroud. And so you'll see we're actually lining up priest feathers here, because this is 18 seconds of invis pot is actually not enough to get us there. And this is a really finicky time in the dungeon, because it's actually at the dead start of a pull here. And we need to get all the way to the first boss room and pull one mob, because if we skip the entirety of this opening gate, we are actually short one mob, which is another really annoying thing. But obviously, it's one of those things that once you know, but this mob is a patrol. So you literally could do this dungeon, and back in challenge mode, you can just reset them whenever you wanted. You could do this dungeon and it would just not be there. The patrol would be all the way on the other side. And so you'd either be sitting there for like 15 seconds waiting for him to come into the boss, or you'd have to get him at the end of the boss. Obviously, ideally, you'd invis pot, get this mob, take it on top of the boss and kill it. Yeah, it's actually really shocking how annoying the start of this dungeon was, because back in WoD, invis potions were 10-minute potion CD. Now that's not the case anymore either. So they have fixed that as well. But there was a lot of times where you would do it, fail, and then you have to sit there for like 8 minutes waiting for your potion to be back up again. So a lot of those problems have been smoothed out. But in Mythic Plus, you cannot restart. And if you fail, that's it, right? It's just like in Mists. If you fail that first skip, that's pretty much it. You're now just going to be overcount, or you just can't do the route you want to do, But there is absolutely no wiggle room in this dungeon. You cannot skip anything else other than the start of this dungeon. So you either go overcount, or you do an invis potion out of the gate. And if anybody fails it, that's probably the key. I don't even actually have to show anything else other than this screen as well, because you can see the timer is 15 minutes. It's a 3-boss dungeon and it's a 15-minute timer. Now that's to get gold. So I don't know what it would be in reality, but it's a very, very short dungeon. Now some people might like that, but personally I do not like that, because a short dungeon typically means it's going to be very tight. If you make any mistake in a long dungeon, you usually have that wiggle room of like, oh, we're just clearing trash at like 15% faster than Blizzard's like numerical perspective on the dungeon dictates. But when you're doing a 30-minute dungeon, you have much less time for that. Like you can't accidentally wipe 2 or 3 times and expect to still upgrade a key that short. But on the other end, with Tyrannical and Fortified being different, now this could be a very interesting dungeon for fixes, because the bosses might be, a big problem, but will the trash pose any problem at all? You might be surprised at how the trash looks in this dungeon too, which we will show, but it's a very short dungeon, and personally, I do not like very short dungeons. If you do, then yeah, obviously your opinion may differ from mine. Another thing that I really disliked about this dungeon is how all 3 bosses are basically gimmick bosses. They're all dumb and really weird mechanics that as a tank, it's whatever, but I think as a whole group, you really don't like them. This boss is very similar to the first boss in Spires in the fact that you have 2 targets, and this time they do not share health, okay? So typically you're going to want to tank this big guy on top of the other target, and that's the one that you ultimately need to kill to finish the fight. Obviously you have to kill both, but the other one is a ranged mob. It's kind of like everything I hate about some trash packs where they constantly try to run away from you and disengage away from you, but on a boss. So you can't grip it. You have to constantly drag stuff like from one corner of the room all the way to the other. And the key mechanic on this fight is actually making this brute guy run into the other mob. The boss, like the ranged boss, is going to jump up on these platforms, and the only way anybody will be able to attack it is by making the actual boss charge into that right there. And you'll see this right here. It's going to do this mad dash ability, and it's going to charge, and luckily I'm going to hit it. But so that's kind of similar to the hooks in Necrotic Wake. If I miss that, if I don't get that lined up perfectly, we're going to wipe, you know? And so a lot of those things that I see, like I hate it when, see how that boss jumps away? I hate it when bosses and mobs in general try to separate from each other. Now, obviously, again, the game's changed a lot, so there's a lot more movement speed in the game now. It's a lot easier to move things. The first boss is a big problem for me, and it's not even it's the third worst boss in here. The next one, I can tell just by the timestamp I left on the video, it says, I'm going to pull one, get it to 50%, and drag it to the next. This is one of my least favorite things as a tank in Mythic Plus, is when you have always like this, where it's basically a gauntlet. You see these mobs are raining fire on the ground, and not only do you have to dodge that, but you have to actually kill the mobs. The mobs are the ones doing it. It's just a single mob in a hallway filled with chaos, right? Does anybody actually like that? I mean, I talk about Theater of Pain being like one of the easier dungeons all the time, and people constantly push that back in my face, telling me like, you can't do big AoE pulls, right? Well, this dungeon has got some really bad cases for that here, but this one is certainly the worst of it. There's just a single mob on stairs that you can fall off of, okay? If you fall off, you go all the way back down to the bottom. Yeah, actually combining them is a huge pain because they constantly do these bleeds. You might be able to tell that I'm taking this bleed and I'm taking more damage from it over time. So actually combining them is dangerous. That's why we're going to get 1 to 50 and then drag it up to the next one. Because if I just pulled all 3 of them together, there'd be no way I would live. They keep putting the stacking dot on me. So if 3 of them were putting it on it, it would, just stack 3 times as fast. And there'd just be no way to live it. Now, of course, again, survival and the way things are focused, that's going to be very dependent on how the tuning goes. But, honestly, if you look at Legion dungeons and how Legion dungeons were so difficult, I think that a lot of that we did see in Legion Mythic Plus. Like that same ratio of difficulty was still there. So these mobs are still going to be a massive pain. And considering you literally can only fight one at a time, I don't think anybody is going to really enjoy doing that. Now we get on to the proper part of the dungeon, and this is where things start to become a lot more normal, a lot more like a regular dungeon. And there's a lot of trash here, and a lot of people pull it very aggressively. So we'll see what I actually do here. But this gunner mob is the main mob you need to be aware of in this area. And I think people are really going to dislike fighting this trash because, as you see, it does a pretty wide frontal, and you have very little space to actually navigate. Like, you are in a less than 30-yard range area side to side. You cannot move left to right at all. All you really can do is move front to back. And for me, obviously it's a video game, but I do still feel a little uncomfortable being in a space like that, like a little claustrophobic, honestly. When you cannot easily move out of mechanics and you have to be not only aware of where they're facing, but aware of where you can move, I think it really creates problems. So a lot of times you're just kind of stuck in a very small area trying to kill a boss that does a massive frontal, and all around you is death and danger, and that's exactly how this trash is. But to be honest, it's only trash. So I think a lot of people come to new ways to circumvent difficulty in trash. The problem I have, though, with this pack and the packs that are coming up is it's constant. Like here, you'll see a pack that not only forces us to be aware of where we are, but actually creates area denial underneath the pack, and we are actually just stopping it, like chain stopping it with stuns. And you see we actually just fail to stop it. Now there's a giant fire patch on the ground, and so if we didn't chain stop that, there'd be a ton of fire patches on the ground. And the meta in WoD challenge modes was like, we have massive amounts of AoE stuns. Like everybody had that doesn't exist anymore. So now when you have all of these mobs doing things that are super dangerous and you have to constantly dodge, if you don't actually have all these different ways to stop them from casting and that type of coordination, are you actually going to be able to survive this trash? And again, this is like the equivalent of like a 15 in my opinion. Like we're going to be doing keys potentially that are like 20 plus. Is that actually going to be something that you could make a mistake on and survive? I don't know. It seems insanely punishing, and I don't really know how you fix that, because the reason it's punishing is just the physical design of the dungeon. It's not the actual tuning of the ability or the mechanic itself. It's just that it's so hard to actually dodge. The reason I hate this boss so much is because the entire time you're doing all the core mechanics of the fight, you're getting pushed back by the wind, and it's like a train RP. Like, obviously, yeah, you're on a train. That's cool and all for like a normal dungeon, but when you're actually trying to do a very dangerous boss fight and you're constantly being pushed back, it's a real pain. So the way you dodge the pushback is by standing in the center here, but the center is where all the mechanics are happening. So you'll see that suppressive fire mechanic, and the way you do that is you have to line of sight that, which means that as a healer, you're going to be constantly being line of sighted by people. Everybody's going to be getting pushed around and kind of scattered around. You're having to heal while you're constantly being pushed back. And if you step into this area here to heal people, they'll probably be line of sight for you. So I can see this being a very frustrating place to heal, but also play a ranged DPS. The way the fight is meant to work, though, is you're meant to be killing these mobs, taking the items they give you and using them in those cannons there. You would get all this stuff done from the boss, and this is all technically the boss, so I don't know how it ends up scaling, but you could see like these giant area denials as well. He makes the areas of the car like catch on fire, so you have to line of sight in different places and everybody gets all spread out. But yeah, you could potentially drag all this stuff in and use these cannons to kill stuff. So we'll see, you know, how severe they scale, but I think they probably will do a lot of damage still because it is how the fight works. And this is basically just like some kind of gauntlet. Like, you don't get any count for any of this stuff. It gives 0 count. So it's basically just like a 10-minute fight. And literally, if you watch like the best runs in the world of this, the only reason that they are able to make this dungeon go fast is because they break this fight. Like, there's like 7 or 8 different ways you can break this fight. The most easy, like the most concrete one, was to reflect the damage. Now, if you never did a WOD challenge mode, in WOD there was like 5 or 6 different ways that you can reflect damage, and they were all absurdly broken in challenge mode. So I think a lot of people are going to find a fight like this especially is going to really challenge your group's survival, and how you'll actually live through it will be up to you. In the old days, the easiest way to solve that was simply to just use these types of reflection things we have here. And so like things like Spell Reflect and Dark Sim would actually allow you to kill the boss before he was attackable. And you'll see this here. The guy will come down without full health. Basically what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to break his cannon, and then he comes down here and then you fight him. So we have basically not even started the fight yet, but typically he dies pretty fast because you come down here and you could use the cannons on the actual encounter, kill him. But you see he's actually going to spawn with like 40% health here, and that's because people were reflecting the damage onto the boss. So you could actually, and if you did this really well, you could straight up have this boss dead before you even can attack him, and that won't be possible now. So you'll be basically killing probably like at least 5+ minutes of RP that gives no count whatsoever, and then fighting a boss, all in these conditions where you're constantly being pushed back, constantly dealing with waves of ads, probably running into your ranged DPS or healer that are trying to line of sight the other mechanics, but in general still the boss spawns and you can just kill him with the cannon as well. So like you got to use that well. That's like an item on the ground. You know, it's kind of similar to maybe like the weapons in Necrotic Wake. Like if you don't use the weapons well on this boss is an absolute mess. I think there's a lot of things in this dungeon specifically that a lot of people won't actually like. And I would be very interested to hear for anybody who is going to vote for this dungeon, because what did you like about this dungeon? I think it's a very poorly inspired dungeon. The mechanics, like the physical elements of it, are very poorly made for a timed, like a race dungeon, you know what I mean? It's got no optional trash whatsoever, and you have to go over count if you just pull in a straight line, which is, you know, obviously how most players are going to do it. I mean, I don't really see anything redeeming about it. So I think a lot of people maybe don't even know that, you know, they just think like, oh, I did it on normal, it was a cool dungeon, but it's an awful dungeon. The tuning was a mess as well. But like I said, that's perfectly in the realm of change there. Hopefully Blizzard will make some adjustments to that. This was always, out of MoP and WoD dungeons, this was the one I hated the most because the timer was insanely tight. There was no like slam dunk skips. Like in some of the other dungeons that are up for vote, like you could literally skip like huge swaths of the dungeon that would dramatically save time. Like I'm talking about kind of like Motherload, you know, where like if you skip that second and third segment of trash, it's just way faster. And those dungeons were like inspired by dungeons like Slag Mines and Everbloom and Skyreach, you know, like skipping massive difficulty that made the dungeon just objectively easier. Not a single thing like that in Grimrail Depot. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Honestly, like I said, go vote for whatever you want. It's not really going to matter to me. At the end of the day, I'll probably still not be too happy about having to do WoD dungeons and Shadowlands, but you know, let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and hopefully this has helped some people. So thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.